From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Ev Small, I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival, and also on behalf of the Library of Congress. I'm a former editor at the Washington Post and now working at the Library of Congress, so I get two good places there. Just a caveat, you may have noticed the cameras. The Library of Congress films these talks for webcasts on its website. So if any of you told your families you were going off to work for a few hours, please duck down when the camera pans the crowd. But we want to make sure you know that. Right now, we're gathered to hear from Elizabeth Kostova, whose first novel, the eerie, hypnotic, and authentic The Historian, is what one reviewer called a toothsome reworking of the Dracula myth. Indeed. It's worth pointing out for all of you book lovers here today that Kostova's undead Dracula is a historian, an archivist, and a bibliophile of sorts, what one reviewer calls a bibliomaniac, which probably describes many of you as well. A Dracula with a penchant for librarians. What could be better? Kostova spent a good part of 10 years writing The Historian, but it immediately soared into the stratosphere, becoming the fastest-selling hardback debut novel in U.S. history, a record we think it still holds. Maybe the case. We need look no farther than right across the mall from where we're sitting now to the National Gallery of Art for the momentum for her current novel, The Swan Thieves, where an attack on a painting propels the story. Don't anybody get any ideas? Elizabeth Kostova has worked at a number of things, including recording folk music in Bulgaria and mowing lawns, at least according to one source. But we're lucky she turned to writing. In her work, she conjures up the powerful effects of myths, the power of obsessions, and the pleasure of old libraries. One last thing I'll tell you that you might not know, her interest in books and libraries started early. According to a reliable source, her mother, who was a librarian, took her and her sisters to the public library, and they were each allowed to check out 30 books, for which they had a special shelf at home. So please welcome book lover Elizabeth Kostova.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me well? Good, okay, and I'm already knocking the mic off the stand, but I'll try not to do that again. I know many of you are librarians, and I feel I should say something about this before I say all the usual formalities, which is that when my mother, who is one of my best readers in addition to being a librarian, read the manuscript for The Historian, she said, you know, I love this book, and I'm just a little concerned about the fate of all these librarians. So I was very careful to dedicate my second book to her, which she has appreciated and which we have shared. I do love libraries, and like all of you, I love books, and I'm so thrilled to see this outpouring of people and readers today here on the mall. And I also want to say I'm so thrilled to see all the reading programs. I hope that you've all had a chance to check those out, the programs that help us raise readers in this country. That 30 books at the library story is true, and I think it is a great gift to children to be given books and taken to the library. So I want to say thank you very much to the festival for having me. I'm honored, and I'm honored that you're all here. I'm going to speak very briefly, because what I'd really like to do is answer your questions and talk about the subjects you would like to discuss. So I'll just tell you, as you heard, my first book, The Historian, took me 10 years to write. The good news for those of you who read it is that my second book, The Swan Thieves, which came out in January, is about 120 pages shorter. So I feel that it also took me about 4.5 years to write. So I feel I'm getting shorter and faster, I hope. The inspirations for the two books were very different. The first one as you know, is about Dracula. I have to say it was a great surprise to me to find myself writing a literary novel with elements of the supernatural. I'm always very surprised when people say to me, I don't usually, something I feel, I don't usually read vampire books. I don't either. I never read vampire books. And then I'm always pleased when they say, I enjoyed this one anyway. So I was fascinated to hear Isabel Allende's talk. I hope some of you heard that. Yes. And she's someone I admire very much as a person as well as a writer. And I loved what she said about how she lives other lives by writing fiction. And one of the things that's been very entertaining to me about having written a book that's about its experiences with the mythical Dracula is that people still ask me whether this is not a biography. And so no, it's not. One of the joys about writing a book about the Impressionists, and as you heard, some of the scenes in the Swan Thieves are set right here in the National Gallery around some of the fantastic paintings in the 19th century galleries there. But one of the great things about writing a book about the Impressionist painters is that nobody asks you ever whether you believe in them or not. So I would like to actually open this up very early to questions because I think I'll be able to tell you more and tell you exactly what you'd like to know. I hope so. So if you wouldn't mind coming up to the mics, I'm actually a little bit hard of hearing, and I'll answer the question you asked if you come to the mic instead of something I made up. So that would be great. Nobody has any questions? Okay. Yes, at this mic.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
First of all, I very much enjoyed both of your books. I'd just like to say that up front. I noticed on your website, when I last checked it, that there's been someone hired to write a screenplay for the historian. And my experience has been that really great books often make really lousy movies. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to any concerns you might have had or any influence that you have tried to maintain on turning the historian into a movie. Thank you.
Thank you. Did everyone hear the question? Well, it's about the movie that's projected for the historian. Yes, of course, when you write a novel, you feel concerned about what might happen to it when it becomes a movie, if you're lucky enough to sell it for a movie deal. And it did sell several years ago, quite a few years ago now, about 4.5 years ago, to Sony Columbia Pictures. And it sold to a studio that has made some wonderful movies, Red Wagon Pictures, and I'm sure all of you have seen some of their movies. They make some blockbusters, and they've also made some really good movies from books, including novels, including Memoirs of a Geisha, on which they worked for 7 years very closely with the author Arthur Golden. They have a track record of working closely with authors, which I liked. But I think when you sell a book to Hollywood in particular, you do have to kind of let go of it because it's likely to become a very different animal. And I'm curious to see what they do. But in the end, all I could do was choose the studio that seemed closest to what I wanted. I will tell you one really quick thing, and then I'll take the next question. When I first went out to meet with the studio, they said, well, I asked them, I have one very frank question. Do you intend to make a horror movie out of this novel? And they laughed and they said, well, we've heard how you feel about horror, that you're not a fan of the hardcore genre. And we want you to know that we intend to make a movie that will be terrifying and beautiful. And I thought that was such a good answer for a novel like this. So that gives me a lot of faith in this studio. Yes, please.
The historian. Although I do read a lot of supernatural fiction, I like other types, historical especially. What I loved about that book was the nested journals of how you did and how you straddled the 20th century's history, Cold War and pre-Cold War. And so for me, Dracula kind of emerging out of this made a whole lot of sense. Thematic. But I'm curious, what made you pick that framework for the novel? Those interacting journals of interacting people.
The question was about the structure of the historian. It is a series of documents. In fact, the whole book is a document that's put together by the main character. And there are a lot of journals and letters and even an academic paper in it. And I stole this shamelessly from Victorian novelists. They, for me, are the great models and the novelists I read the most often, although I read a lot of contemporary fiction as well. But I love that sense when I'm a reader of having been given a document, especially letters and journals. It also is a way to get very close to characters. I think there's a part of us, probably not a very good part of us, that would love to read other people's mail. So even if we shouldn't and we don't, there's a kind of joy in being allowed that close to a character. So that was part of it. The other reason I chose that format was that it's what Bram Stoker used for his brilliant novel, Dracula. And Dracula, I have no idea whether Dracula is great literature or not, but it's just one of the best reads I've ever read. And as you know, it's completely told in documents, and you get an amazing sense of the characters through that structure. So it really was because of the Victorians. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
My question is more of a writer process question. What is your writing process, and how did you maintain your stamina over 10 years? And it's such a dense, rich book, to keep going, keep it organized, keep remembering all the storylines and the threads through it.
Thank you for that question about writing process. I've had a very different writing process with each of my two books. I'm now working on a third, and again, it's quite different from the first two. When I wrote The Historian, I did keep going for 10 years, and I was really fascinated to hear what Diana said a few minutes ago about writing her first book. That rang very true for me as well, that she kept going partly because she wanted to prove to herself that she could finish something. And that was incredibly important to me. I had a feeling I might be stuffing this into a drawer forever, but that I would know I could finish something. And I wanted to be able to do that. I also had 3 children under the age of 6, like Diana. And when in fact, I started it right before they were born, so they were even younger than that part of the time. And frankly, I think it was an escape. I think that it was the part of my day, even when it was 20 minutes of my day, when I actually was handling something that didn't have egg on it. So it was a great sort of personal vacation, including doing the research. And the research took a long time. That's one of the things that makes me a very slow writer. The writing process, I think, is fascinating to all of us. And when I wrote The Historian, because that book has a very careful, logically plotted kind of framework, about halfway through, I outlined all of the rest of the book. And the first manuscript of it was about 1,100 pages, first typescript. So I really would have lost my way eventually if I hadn't plotted it carefully and worked on it in the order in which you read it, pretty much. I learned a long time later that the best way, the most efficient way to write a mystery is to know what the heart of the mystery is. In the case of detective fiction, that's the crime. In the case of an historical novel, that might be a mystery from history. But to know that ahead of time, and then go back to the beginning and work forward to that. So I think I must have written it in the least efficient way possible. But it worked for me. It's the order in which you read it. Finally, though, I had a sort of, after I finished that, I had a revelation. I was visiting with a friend who's a wonderful novelist and short story writer. And I asked her what she'd been working on, and she said, I've been working on my novel this morning. And I said, wow, that's lovely. What chapter are you on? And she said, well, I don't know. And I was shocked by this. I had no idea you were allowed to write a book in that way. And so I promised myself that if I ever wrote another novel, I would try to write the way she did, which was to have the arc of a story, the characters, and then to write whatever seemed most compelling at the time, whatever voice was most important, whatever scene occurred to her. And then, of course, when you do that, you end up with masses of material which you have to stitch together. This was the way I wrote The Swan Thieves, which has a heavily psychological, very intimate feel to it, and it was a great process for that particular kind of story because of that. But of course, I had to spend about over a year putting it together in the order in which you read it, which is now an interweaving of the 20th and 19th centuries. Can everyone hear me all right? It feels like it's bouncing in and out, but maybe that just makes it sort of, I don't know, it gives it texture. But if you start being able to not hear me, please wave from the back. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Hi. It may interest you to learn that your grandmother, Eleanor Stevens, was my high school librarian in Asheville, North Carolina, and helped to instill in me a great respect for books and love for reading. So, yes. And,
thank you so much for
you're
telling me
welcome.
that.
And my question is, I'm very intrigued by your interest in myth and its import in our lives, our understanding of our own psyches. One author who I think exemplifies this in her writing and whose books I love very much is Sue Monk Kidd and her book, The Secret Life of Bees. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about your love for myth and your interest in myth.
Thank you so much, and thank you for telling me that. I'm thrilled. My grandmother was a wonderful encourager of reading, and in her family as well as in the library. I'm so happy to hear that. And she read all of Jane Austen aloud to me by the time I was 16. So I can't think of a better training for a writer. So thank you. I am very interested in myth, although I'm certainly no expert on it. I imagine many of you know much more about it. I've never studied myth in a kind of formal, comprehensive way. But I think that it's fascinating that there are stories that last for us, and some of them have lasted for thousands of years, and they're still powerful for us. Dracula has become one of those, although over hundreds rather than thousands of years. In The Swan Thieves, I heavily use the myth of Leda and the Swan, which is a favorite subject of painters, of course, through the ages. But it's also, I think, just one of the strangest, most fascinating stories out there, the story of a human being and the divine, or a human being and the beast. Do we know whether it's the beast or the divine? It's really an amazing story when you think about it. I think it's very interesting that if you look, for example, at the movies that are sort of box office enormous hits, or television shows that have millions of people glued to them, at the heart of those you find exactly the elements that we love in our myths. I had the experience a few years ago when my children were quite a bit younger of reading aloud to them from that wonderful book of Greek myths, the D'Aulaire's book, which probably some of you have, that has watercolor illustrations. It's a classic children's work on myth, but a pretty sophisticated one. And my children, who are pretty good, but they, like most children, they never believed in bedtime or baths. I guess that's normal. But when we were reading that book, which is all about things like Helen of Troy and people chained to rocks so their livers can be eaten out by an eagle, they would say every night to one another, "Quick, get your pajamas on. Get your pajamas on. We're going to have Greek myths," which I think is so remarkable. There's just something deep in us that responds to these stories, and they can be chosen only by time. Thank you.
Mine piggybacks on that a little bit. Would you talk a little bit about your time as a child and your father telling you the stories of Dracula and how that all, did it scare you? Did that come back to you as you were writing? Would you talk a little bit about that? Thank you.
Thank you. The question was about the stories my father told me about Dracula when I was a child. And I feel I should hasten to say that my father is a very nice man. He is a wonderful storyteller, and from the time my sisters and I were little, he told us a lot of great stories, many of them from his imagination, but some of them, as in the case of Dracula, from things like movies he had grown up with. And he grew up in Brooklyn and Queens in the 30s, 40s, early 50s, and he went to all those classic Dracula movies, Bela Lugosi and all those great Dracula classics. So his Dracula stories were heavily based on those movies, which in turn, of course, is based on the Bram Stoker book. And in them, the noble Englishman always tracked Dracula to his lair. In his stories, it always worked out very well for the good guys, and they always ended in Dracula's castle. He told us these stories while we were traveling in Eastern Europe. He's a professor, and he was given a post in Slovenia and then in Yugoslavia. So the magical thing about this for us as children was that we often were hearing them while we were actually having a picnic at the foot of a 13th century castle, for example. So they were incredibly real. It gave me a sense that myth and history and travel were all kind of one, could all come together and be one thing in the mind. So that is why I dedicated my first book to him. Thank you for asking about that. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. The historian introduces us to so many wonderful and exciting new places. Where has been your favorite place to travel?
The question is, where has my favorite place to travel been? That's honestly very hard for me to answer. I love thinking about that. Many of the places in the historian are places I know very well. I lived there or I traveled there long before I wrote the book. A couple of them I didn't get to until after I'd finished the manuscript, either for research or even after the book was published. So I had to do a tremendous amount of research to make sure I knew what those places would have looked like, smelled like, sounded like at those particular periods. And it would be very hard for me to choose, but I have to say that Bulgaria is extremely, extremely close to my heart. My husband is from Bulgaria, and I've been going there off and on for more than 20 years. And I have a kind of second life there where I know a lot of writers, publishers, but also a lot of people who have nothing to do with the literary world and are very interesting people living in a way that is in some ways extremely different from what I grew up with. And Bulgaria was such an inspiration to me for the historian. As you know, it's if you read the book, about a third of the novel is set in Bulgaria in the 1950s. And when I went back there on book tour, the book was touchingly a huge success in Bulgaria, in Bulgarian translation. And when I went back there, I met so many wonderful writers who were struggling to have any opportunities. It's hard to be a writer anywhere, but in Eastern Europe, after the collapse of communism, there was just no funding for the arts. So a few years ago, I started a foundation with the international royalties from the historian to provide competitive opportunities for writers in Bulgaria, literary writers. It also provides opportunities for American writers to go to Bulgaria and work with translators and with Bulgarian writers. So I really urge you to check it out. It's become much bigger than just my own project. And if you'd like to see the website for it, if you're a writer and you'd like to apply, for example, it's www.ekf for Elizabeth Kostova Foundation.edu. Thank you for asking that.
Actually, I think you just answered my question. I read The Historian as a Peace Corps volunteer in Romania on the Bulgarian border, and I was pretty surprised and pleased at the spot-on psyche and kind of characters of the Eastern Europeans in the book. So congratulations. How did your interest in Eastern Europe start, since you just explained where you've been?
That's amazing that you did that. Wonderful. It must have been a great experience. Peace Corps in Romania. And I have been interested in Eastern Europe since I was 7 because of my father's career, because he took us there. And we lived in Slovenia for about 6 months. So it was long enough for us to really get a feel for it. And I've stayed interested ever since, really, and so have my parents. So it just seemed like a natural place to set a novel. And I'm very pleased that it seemed, with your experience there, which I'm sure was profound, I'm very pleased that you found it accurate for what you knew of people there. So thank you.
I also have a Bulgarian-directed question. My father-in-law escaped from communist Bulgaria, and so my husband and I were thrilled to see so much Bulgaria in a novel, and also I can see my father-in-law and his personality and quirks in the novel, which was really fun. I guess my follow-up question is, how much of that part of the world, Romania and Bulgaria, inspired your story, and how much did you have to include all your great descriptions of the scenery because of the material that you chose?
Thank you. Your family sounds very interesting, and again, I'm glad it seemed accurate to you. I found that writing a book about Dracula, of course, makes Romania a major topic, and I really tried to include scenery that seemed to fit the story itself. So places to have the characters go to real places, and many of those places you can go. In fact, I was sort of half pleased, half horrified to hear that there are historian tours in both Bulgaria and Romania now. I really recommend that they may be very good tours, but I recommend you just take your backpack and get on the train and ignore them, because you'll see probably much more off the beaten path places. But I did try not to simply hit famous places in those two countries, but to really incorporate the story and the scenery. And they're beautiful countries. I mean, if most of you probably saw the movie Cold Mountain, that was filmed in the Carpathians in Romania, which is why the mountains don't look quite right. But it's gorgeous. They're wonderful countries to visit. Does that answer your question, or was there another part?
No, the last 3 have covered my question.
Great, good. I just want to tell one really quick story. When I was in graduate school, I was in a wonderful writing class that included some graduate students from other departments at the University of Michigan. And there was a young woman there who announced on the first day when we had self-introductions that she was from Romania. And I was in the middle of writing the historian and feeling pretty shy about it. I mean, I wrote it in private, mostly in private for those 10 years. And I went over to her after class one day and I said, I was fascinated by the fact that you said you're from Romania, and I wondered if I could talk with you because I'm writing a novel that's partly about Romania. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, that sounds great. I sure hope it's not about Dracula." So I'm afraid, and I have to add that she's one of my best friends now. And she helped me enormously with the historian and ended up really approving of the book and helping me with Romanian dialect and Transylvanian customs, and she's very knowledgeable. But I think that Eastern Europe, of course, has had its share of stereotypes, and so I've also tried to stay away from some of those. A last question?
Vampires have become a real pop culture phenomenon in the last couple of years. Did you know when you started writing about vampires that you would be part of this whole plethora of books and movies and TV shows about vampires?
When I wrote The Historian, I have to say it was a little bit before that wave that has included the Twilight series but it was after Anne Rice. And as I said, I'm not really, to be honest, I'm not a reader of genre vampire literature, so I wasn't very familiar with a lot of those books. But I have been astonished since then by this wave of this parade of vampires into popular culture. I do think that this is nothing new. I mean, vampires live up to their reputation by never, ever dying, even if you want them to. And I think and this started in about 1760 in literature, And it happens every 40, 50 years. And I think, again, in the mid-21st century, when everybody has forgotten this and we're on to something else, vampires will come back, and some of us will be saying to our grandchildren, oh, I think there was some kind of vampire craze back in about 2007 or 8. So I think it's the nature of vampires. And again, I think that speaks to the power of myth in our lives, that we love this, we love and we love to hate this figure of ourselves in the form of the vampire, something human but also evil, something recognizable. It's a lot scarier and a lot more interesting than say, the Blob, or something that doesn't seem as close to us. I think we're fascinated by that. So for anybody who's around in, say, 2065 or 70, let's just keep an eye out and see if they come back. Thank you so much for all your wonderful questions.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.